Sure.
Or they turn on.
Let me turn Joey up because he's a little
Oh, we
quiet.
need like a theme song. That's what we should.
Hello, YouTube.
Oh my word.
It's like the
Hello.
Twitch stream where everybody puts like the hi YouTube when they finally get the world record.
Don't forget to subscribe and press the like button.
Everybody smash the like button.
Yes.
Okay.
You gotta help
And the
out the
little bell.
YouTube algorithm.
Ring that bell.
This
Just
Okay.
comment.
this stream is brought to you by Raid Shadow Legends.
Yes, it is.
No, we're not sellouts.
Yeah.
Jeez, something classy like Raycon earbuds or something. Like
Yeah, there you go.
Oh wait. The what is that? What are those fancy noise canceling headphones? The Cohen E8s.
the Cohen E8s.
Yeah.
Yeah, just use the code Joey's Bald 15 to save 15% off your next pair.
Exactly.
It's great.
Oh, boy.
There you go.
I just got some noise canceling headphones and they're phenomenal, man. They're worth
Yeah,
it.
me too. Yeah, me too. They're nice.
Did you really?
I really did, yeah.
I've been wanting to get a pair, but I was like, eh. Oh, I
Cohen
couldn't.
I just wish they made headphones that canceled out the noise that came out of them.
That's big brain right there.
Big brain.
I might modify these later.
Wait a minute.
He can handle it. It's okay.
There's an ACM meetings server.
Yeah, because we created that so that Dr. Thomas could join that one.
Nice.
How'd you just find that?
You just sent it to me.
Oh, I accidentally. I have
Open mic.
echo.
La la la.
I randomly hit something and I had no idea what I hit. And now I do.
Nice.
I'm gonna change my input settings to be the line in.
Yeah.
That won't be distracting at all.
No. Hey, we have a good turnout today.
Yeah, it was pretty good.
Heat.
So, are we gonna learn about our future overlords?
Yes. That's
I thought
the
this was
whole
about the
point of this.
Terminator series.
I will be
Okay.
back.
Alright, should I get started?
Yeah, you can go ahead and get started.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So if you don't know, I like AI. And currently I'm applying to various schools to study machine learning as a PhD student at various colleges so I've kind of looked into this a decent amount, and I think we've had a lot of interesting discussions in politics and other things in recent so I think it's important for us to understand what the questions are, especially as tech people, to understand what the questions are, why they come up, and what the terms are that go with all the questions, so that we can have an actual discussion and not pretend to know what we're talking about, but at least have some idea. Which is usually better to be informed than not. Let's see, can I go there? So yeah, so what's the point of this? We're going to stress the terms and the questions. Not necessarily, there's going to be one, I think there might be one slide where I voice what I think my opinions are of something, and I'll make it very clear when it's my opinion. And I'll also make sure to bring up other opinions as I go. So that's the whole point, just to bring up the terms and the questions. And so if we're going to talk about artificial intelligence, we have to know what the definition is. And the definition, people like to play fast and loose with it. It kind of comes across as the I know it when I see it kind of thing. And so I was able to find one definition from the National Defense Authorization Act fiscal year 2019, which, and I kind of underlined the key things. AI, it's going to be able to learn. It's going to have human-like perception, cognition, planning, learning. It's going to act like a human. It's going to approximate things. It's going to achieve goals. So this is kind of like a lot of like ideas of what it's supposed to be. And I kind of tried to boil that down into it's a system. That shouldn't be an and, that should be an a. But it's a system that approximates human behavior with learning or statistical methods from data to achieve a goal. which is broad, and that's kind of the annoying part of artificial intelligence is it is kind of a broad category that we talk about. Um, but yeah, this is kind of I think it's the most simplified way to define it in a way that's not too oversimplistic, if that makes any sense. So are there any questions on that? Because that's kind of like the first thing to make sure we all are on the same page.
So when did you become sentient?
When did I become sentient?
Yes.
That is a question on biological intelligence, and that's outside the scope of this talk.
No. I am implying that you were artificially created.
Well, we'll talk about that towards the end.
Okay, cool. Just wanted to make
that's-
sure.
Yeah, sentience is kind of.
I
I
do
mean,
have-
it's going to be the end. So.
Yeah, I do have a question. And I think this is probably what you're getting at with we'll talk about it later, but at what level of intelligence can something be considered artificial intelligence? Because there's different levels of intelligence with like biological creatures and stuff like that, and like uh snakes aren't all that smart, but
Yeah.
they do have a form of intelligence, like,
Yes.
and it wouldn't really be that hard to create a software agent, to borrow the turn of phrase from the previous slide, to basically replace a snake. You know what I mean?
Yeah. There is a. I'm going to answer this in a roundabout way. There is a fly that we call the Drosophila. That's like its technical name. And we have mapped out its entire brain, all 135,000 neurons and all of the connections, and given them. So to say that we understand how we could create something that has, quote, something of above playing Pong, which obviously just follow the ball, but below filing my taxes, which is, I don't know, that was the most complicated thing I could think of. But in there, I think the key is that it's trying to approximate behavior and it's not just following set rules. That's kind of one of the key things that I've kind of seen in artificial intelligence. Like, it can be really bad at playing Pong, but if it's trying to like approximate learning it and it's not set rules, then some people might call that artificial intelligence.
So can we, if we extend that a little bit further, and we ignore the biological versus what have you,
Sure.
would that mean that like if you take that same snake and you ignore the fact that it's biological, would that not qualify as artificial intelligence?
I think if you
Assuming-
were able to
ass-
make it, it would be artificial intelligence.
I see. So there's no real like smartness it requires to qualify in your opinion. I see. Okay.
I mean, if you think about it, you can have really, really stupid machine learning algorithms. They get, they do, like, there's the classification of handwritten letters or numbers. Sorry, you can do extremely poorly on that. But if you're doing it with some of these learning methods and statistical methods and doing data analysis to figure it out, instead of this picture is a 3, and like just assigning it and having a rule for it, then I think, even though it's terrible and it might be worse than the rule-based ideas,
I see what you're saying. So you're trying to say that it instead of the classification comes from that it responds to stimuli rather than following an algorithm.
yeah, pretty much.
Okay.
There's
All right,
definitely
that
more
makes sense.
nuance you can get in there, but I think for general purpose, that's pretty good. So yeah, artificial intelligence. It's a weird term. It's a loose term, and concerningly, it's a loose term in the laws that we create, and that can come up, and that's going to be another problem. That as tech people, giving it clear definitions for something is what we like to do. At least I like to try and do it. and this might be one of the things where it starts to get a little bit harder. So, um, proceeding on, if I can click on the right screen. I kind of came up with like 6 of like the hot topics that I felt like most of you guys probably know about some of these, and then I included some that maybe you don't know much about. Um, and trying to understand the terms and the questions and why we have to ask the questions is also a thing. So that kind of the 6 things are going to be replacing jobs. How do we look at that with automation and artificial intelligence? Then we have to look at the AI transparency and the data bias, which kind of go hand in hand with each other. And then from that, we have some of the more kind of like hands-on things with stuff like self-driving cars, flash crashes, and autonomous weapons. And so we'll get into all of those. So the first one, replacing jobs. Yeah. Basically, just go watch the CGP Grey video on humans need not apply. That's where I'm going to get all my talking points. This I personally probably have a bit of bias on this, that I am confident that at some point humans will, like, just robots will be better at doing everything, and then we have to deal with that problem. There's also the other side of this argument, which I didn't highlight much, which is that there's another concept of we need to make sure that we're using robots to help humans instead of replace them, which is another option to try and fix or at least handle the problem. But I'm going to try and focus on just the concept of them being inherently better. And so in the video, he uses the analogy of horses working and how they were replaced. And it's similar to how humans will be replaced. It's not that horses aren't able to do anything. It's that everything the horse can do, a robot can do it better. And so it's not the horse's fault that it can't do anything productive, at least, compared to a robot, because the robot is just that much better. And it leads into the same kind of discussion as humans. At some point, if robots get better than us, then it's not our fault that the robots are going to be doing better than us, and we'll just be stuck without jobs just because a robot can do it better. And so that's the problem. Just go watch the video. I think it sums up everything. And it's very artistic, and CGP Grey's stuff is always great. So I kind of brought up this slide because I think it's an important one in the discussion, and I don't think it's talked about as much. I think that all the people in this chat are kind of lucky that I think we're all at least on the average, or at least around the average, and maybe a bit above it, just because I kind of know all you guys. But that's not the entire population. There's a solid 16% of people that have an 85 or less on the IQ bell curve. And that's not their fault. They're just born like that. And there isn't too much, as far as I know, that you can do to really change your IQ score. You can get better at the IQ test itself, but just like the standard intelligence quotient idea, you don't change it too much. You can learn individual skills, and that's great. And that's how you can learn jobs when you're at a lower point in this, because we really just need you to learn a specialized thing. But in terms of generalization on what people can do, the problem is that people on the lower part of the bell curve are just more likely to get replaced through no fault of their own. It's that the complex jobs are just taken by the people who can do the complex jobs better. It's the same reason why, the average person who, doesn't have a high school education, they can still get a job now, but they're not going to get the same jobs that somebody who has a PhD is going to get, because they don't have the same level of education, and usually they probably have dissimilar levels of IQ. And that's not to say one is good and one is bad. It's just one is valued in different parts of society. And the problem then arises is when robots replace certain parts of society, how do we deal with that? And the problem is they can tend to replace this lower IQ bell curve, or lower IQ portion of the bell curve. And that kind of leaves a problem of the people at the top, as always, kind of are in, it's not replacing them yet. But we have a sizable portion that isn't on the upper end of this, and that's something to deal with. The other point is that robots are kind of increasingly moving across this bell curve. And so at what point are we finally going to say it's a problem? Are we going to do it when it gets to, it's replacing 2% of the population? When it gets to 16%? It's going to keep creeping. And we have to figure out how to either incorporate it, which is an option, or how to just deal with the problem itself. I think this kind of goes into more of, this is a bit where I kind of get a bit biased of saying the question isn't if, it's when, because they are increasingly getting better. If we do try and stay on the path of using AI and humans together, then you could make an argument that we're not going to replace jobs, we're merely going to improve them. But I am not as optimistic on that side. So, I kind of bring it, robots don't sleep, don't take a break, don't need health insurance, don't have a family to take care of, run on pennies of electricity. They're already driving, answering calls, and writing reports. And that's something we need to deal with as we keep creeping up. How many people are we going to let not have jobs through no fault of their own? We need to start thinking about what to do when large sections of the population are unemployable through no fault of their own in a future where, for most jobs, humans need not apply. So that's uplifting. It's just a problem that is something we need to think about. Maybe it's not going to happen for another 200 years, and you think we can deal with it in 150, and that might be an option. I'm not trying to give an answer. I'm trying to lay out what the problem is so we can try and have a discussion before things have already gone too far, which is usually what we should try and do. So I think that's all the slides on replacing jobs. Were there any questions on that? Something you wanted to bring up?
Can you actually say that robots can be placed on the IQ scale? Like, can you say that a robot has IQ, or that they are simply replacing the jobs of people on the lower end of the IQ scale, because those are more basic jobs, and robots can be programmed to do more basic jobs?
Yeah. So right now, robots, it's really easy to have a robot do a really basic job. That's one kind of portion of it. And it's not to say that people on this curve, you can have an IQ that's lower and get a more complex job.
Right.
I don't think any of us are trying to point out people and say you're incompetent completely and you're never going to be able to amount to anything. I don't think that that's true. But so you start off with the easily automated jobs. But increasingly with jobs like driving, answering calls, and writing reports, which are already starting to be automated, we're starting to creep up this curve. And as the algorithms are getting more complex and getting better at doing more complex jobs, then we're replacing increasingly more complex jobs. And as we increase the more complex jobs, we're getting even better at replacing the less complex jobs, which is tough. So I don't know if I answered the question or just danced around it.
I think that's kind of like how. Are you guys familiar with the DOT test for intelligence of animals?
No.
Mm-mm.
So basically, what some biologists have done in the past is, and they still do this, I think, but what they've done is like put like a sticker or something on the forehead of an animal and show themselves in the mirror, and it, uh, like for instance, crows can pass this test, meaning that they can recognize the image in the mirror as themselves, but dogs don't, right? And one of the criticisms of that is that it is very anthropocentric in that we are looking at intelligence through our own eyes and comparing our abilities to interpret stimuli and assuming that every case is going to be the same. So, like dogs, for instance, their primary sense is their sense of smell. So that's kind of what I'm trying to say is I think that it's kind of not necessarily going to be that we can like quantify how intelligent
Hmm.
an artificial agent would be because they have they're always going to have the leg up no matter what, even if it's not artificial intelligence on numerical computing and all this other
Sure.
stuff that computers are better suited for in the first place.
Yeah.
So I think that in order for us to actually quantify that, I think we would have to create a new test for it. I don't think it would be applicable, is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah. Um, I mean, one of the things you can say is, Watson was able to win at Jeopardy, but it still can't take an IQ test. So it technically, in quote, wouldn't fall on the scale yet,
Mm.
in some sense, or I guess in the technical sense it wouldn't. But we'd all say it has some level of quote intelligence, whatever that means. Um, but yeah, I think the question of how do we measure it. I think the Turing test it's an option to show when something is simulating human-like abilities, which is kind of what artificial intelligence is about, is human-like. Um, there's the I can't remember if they called it the enhanced Turing test, where essentially they add video ability to it. The original Turing test was, can you answer questions? Um, and respond like a human so that you're indiscernible from a human. And then the advanced one is, can you have a video and audio stream that is indiscernible from a human video audio stream? So those are kind of options. And part of it is, we don't necessarily need to quantify it in terms of anything. We just need to quantify it in how well it can do a job sometimes. Whether that's playing uh, whether that's playing StarCraft 2 really well, or whether that's writing reports or getting people to click on ads. um, a lot of the times it kind of gets specialized, and in some ways, our abilities kind of do the same. And so maybe that is a valid way to measure it, is on our, the specialization level. Um, so, but yeah, I think definitely figuring out how to quantify it is a great question. um, and it doesn't really particularly have a great answer. Um, yeah. Sorry. So, any other questions on replacing jobs?
I assume that this is, of course, not a worry for the people who own this software. Their jobs are probably safe because it
Y-
really doesn't require a lot of brain power to, you know, have someone else make money for you. So
yeah. Um, owning the algorithm's one thing, and then you're gonna own everything. When the algorithm is able to sufficiently improve itself without anyone's help, that's when we have a problem. uh, and whoever gets that wins.
yes, and the programmer that invented it will be strung up
Yes,
by
it's gonna
angry
be
by angry
quite
web
fun.
designers.
Oh, oh no, the web designers don't do anything. Okay. Uh, I think, yeah, we'll get into transparency of algorithms. Transparency is an important thing with machine learning because it brings up some of like the ethical questions of how do we use this? and should we be using it? And part of the problem with should we be using it is these terms of black box algorithms and explainable AI, which you might have heard before. One of the problems with AI is it's hard to quantify why the algorithms do what they do. It just kind of works. And then we have to look at the uses, which we'll get into more. But as I kind of just said, the black box problem. The algorithms kind of just work because math.
I like it when my code does that, even though I don't know why.
Yeah, it's fun when it does it for entertaining purposes, but when we start having it classify people and predict how much you're going to pay on your interest rates, and we don't know why it works, then we start to get a bit more questioning. And I really like this image because, so this is also from the CGP Grey. This is on his machine learning video. And so there's a couple bots here. This is the bot that's learning to do things, the little white bot, learning to pick images apart. There's two other bots. There's the bot that tests and the bot that makes bots. So the maker bots are randomly making bots and the testing bots randomly testing. And through random chance, you're eventually going to start stumbling towards the best solution, something that works. But the problem with doing that is the testing bot doesn't know why it works. The maker bot doesn't know why it works because it's just making randomly and testing randomly. And because of that, the person who designed the entire system has no idea why it works. It just works because math. And so that leads into problems of the uses of it. This is kind of one of the more infamous pictures of uses of AI that people aren't terribly fond of. Partly because of it has like a really nice Big Brother-esque feel to it. Where's this? This is in Xinjiang, Hebei province. Oh yeah, this is to shame jaywalkers. So if somebody jaywalks, it scans their face, puts it on there, and their personal information up on the, like their name and stuff, so they can be publicly shamed.
DocSpot 3000.
Yeah. Or at the airport. And so, that's, part of the public shaming thing is not a very Western, it's not, we don't use, that's not one of our common methods of encouraging people. Oh, you want to learn about public shaming, buddy? Okay.
I didn't mean to have my push talk key down.
It's okay. But there was something interesting that kind of came up, and I thought it was interesting to put it on the next slide. Is that, the same stuff that's, doing public shaming for jaywalkers in China, we're using it to find the Capitol rioters. So, should we be using it? Is there certain circumstances that we should be using it? Should we just not use it at all because of the potential ramifications it has? Should we spend more time working on it and making it so that we can understand the AI before we try and use it on everything? Those are the kind of questions that are left. Because it seems like this might be a good use of it. I don't know if I can conclusively say that it's a perfect use. I don't like to be quick to judge something as of a use of technology to say that it's the perfect use. But it's a use that we used it for. What are the ramifications of it? Is this completely different from this or this? Or is it similar enough that maybe we should be hesitant? Is it dissimilar enough that we don't have to worry about it at all? it's a question that we have to talk about, especially since facial recognition, as we'll kind of talk about in a little bit, can have some serious ramifications, um, and it can have a lot of inherent problems. One of the reasons it's going to have problems is what's called bias. We've talked, or at least we've heard a lot about things like systemic racism and systemic problems. And I'm going to make a point that artificial intelligence, wherever you fall on the spectrum of how much systemic problems there are systemic problems that happen in artificial intelligence, just quantitatively, which is nice because I don't like having to argue about questions that are arguable. I like them when they have a clear-cut answer. Luckily, this one has some amount of a clear-cut answer that leads to a very unclear question. So we have a machine learning algorithm. We're going to learn it. We're going to teach it to tell Bs from 3s. So we feed it an image, and it tells us whether it's a B or a 3. So that's the whole algorithm. That's the whole thing. We'll teach it to do it. So I feed it like 1 billion images of Bs, and then I feed it like 1,000 images of 3s. What is the probability that when I feed it a 3, that it's going to guess it wrong compared to a B? Is there a difference between the two because I fed it different amounts of data? And, is one of them just more likely to get chosen just because the data set included it more? And so you're like, okay, this is Bs and 3s. That's, who cares if it guesses a B more often than it guesses a 3? And the problem arises is what happens when it's facial recognition data. And we're using it to tell if somebody shows up in police reports. And we feed it more of one skin color than a different one. And you could say, oh, if you feed it too many of one, then they're more likely to get chosen as somebody that will pop up in the system. And that's possible. That's a statistical thing you could figure out. Then the question arises, what if you need more samples of one skin color because it's harder to tell their features apart? Which is a whole nother statistical thing you could come up with. That you could quantifiably say that you're going to need more. And then you come to this question of, so if we need more samples, then they might be overrepresented in the data set. But if we don't have enough samples, then they won't be represented enough. And so what's the perfect balance so that you're not more likely to pick somebody who has a darker skin as somebody that shows up in a police report than somebody with a light skin, just in the inherent algorithm itself? That's the key right there. It has absolutely nothing to do with humans. It's the statistics of the algorithm pointing to one, whether it's race or whether it's gender or whether it's hair color, for all that matters. Is one overrepresented? What's the perfect amount to represent them? How do we account for that? That's the real question that underlies it. So, when we see facial recognition stuff and say it's bad because it can do bad things, this is part of why. There's a mathematical reasoning underlying some of the problems that come from it.
Could there also be bias in that, like, in terms of how you label the data? Because, I mean, you could say that everything's a bee, but you could also, I mean, there's also like different species of bees. And you can also label humans with different races, but then you go into a thing where, there's ethnicities, and how do you define one human into one box and then another human into a different box? Where do you draw the line? The labeling of the data before you shove it into the machine. Right?
Absolutely. Yeah, that's how do we separate all these different bins in such a way that it's going to have any meaningful outcome at the end? It's kind of, especially if you're starting to do things with ethnicity. Also, you have to make sure that the data was correctly categorized at the beginning. If you look at there's the MNIST data set, which is like the gold standard for character recognition, where it has a bunch of numbers that are handwritten. if you look at some of those handwritten numbers, they like it's a 7, but like it could be like a 5 too. You know, maybe it's a 9, but it's kind of got a curl at the end, so maybe it's an 8. You know, there's problems in data sets too. And how do we account for that? Um,
Yeah, there's also like cultural, like it can really depend on the culture too, because like in other countries, you know, they could see one object, but they could label it in a different way.
mhm.
Um, it's just like you got this whole other thing about language, like the language that you use could also affect how you label things or see or categorize the world that makes sense to your culture, but it would be different. Like for example, like I heard that in Russia, um, like the color, like the color spectrum of blue, like they have a different word for like dark blue and light blue, which we don't have a word for it. We just call it blue, but I forget the two terms, but you know, just nuanced things like that, like could also affect like the way you label data.
Yeah. 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 How do we have to cleanse the data when we give it from one group to another? Um, and if like we had that data and then we gave it to Russia and all we have is blue, how would they assess the data when it spits out from the algorithm? Do you take the time to go back and label everything by hand? And when there's 100,000 data points, it's not easy to label it all by hand.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, bias. Okay, so I guess I could stop there for a sec and see if there are any questions on kind of the previous couple things. I kind of merged them all together.
Well, I just wanted to, mention that that kind of plays against like what you're saying with the public shaming thing with the DocSpot 3000 in China. Um, I think that the bias is something that the government doesn't want for sure. But because of the amount, just the sheer amount of people in China, it would, and it's largely a homogeneous society. If I'm not just making an assumption there, uh, it would be quite hard to even fix that bias
Mm-hmm.
because of the amount of data they have on their citizens, and on top of that, um, what is it, like 2/3 of the world's population, lives in that general region.
Yeah.
It, so like facial recognition for tourists would be much harder to do for them,
Mm-hmm.
or for say Russians who live in China
Yeah.
along the border. So I think that that's definitely something that will take a lot of time and effort to accommodate. But is it really possible to get it perfect?
Yeah. Yeah. There's going to be a question of how good is good enough. And that's going to be because I mean, I don't know if we'll ever get it perfect. Is there going to be a point where we just have to agree as society that there's a 0.0000001% chance that because of your hair color or because I'm bald, I'm more likely to get, picked for something? If it's picked for, hey, we should look at this person to see if maybe they did something and then have a human check, then maybe that's okay. But if it's, oh, take the picture and then automatically send them a $5,000, what's the word I'm looking for? Ticket in the mail. Is that, maybe there's a level of approximation that will allow when there's a low enough level of risk and we have to balance the two. That's a likely question to come up.
I think the term that I've learned applies most in life is, or the phrase I've learned applies most in life is there's always a balance. It's just hard to
Mm-hmm.
determine what the balance is.
But couldn't we also use the bias to our in our favor? Like say instead of feeding a super large um, set, right? You just feed a super large set of uh, of what you call people, right? So you just have a set of people, and then you have a subset of those that you're actually looking for, say with facial recognition. So couldn't we use that bias to actually enhance the function of it?
It's definitely possible. I'm not entirely sure, like off the top of my head, how people have or would. Um, I think it's just one of the things that there's a lot of math that's going on that we have to spend more time analyzing before we can be at, sure enough to use it in high risk scenarios. I think is probably the
Okay,
best way to
yeah,
word it.
fair enough. Yeah, this is scary stuff.
Yeah. Um,
That's why it makes Joey happy.
a little bit. Keeps me up
The
at night
excitement.
sometimes.
Keeps the blood pumping.
Yeah.
I mean, there's also I mean, I'm pretty sure it goes along with this, but like in terms of like ethics about how we get the data in the first place,
Yeah.
because in order for a machine, in order for deep learning to work, it needs a lot of data, and it all needs to be labeled. But like for example, I was reading on Scientific American because I was walking past like an article in the library and I picked it up, and I kind of turned the page and I was reading about how in Africa there's like we have a lot of in like genetic databases. We have a lot of like European uh um what is it called, gene or genetic
The genome
yeah,
sequence.
genome. Yeah, we have a lot of European genomes, but in Africa, there's more diverse genomes in Africa, and so
Hmm.
um, gathering data from uh, gathering that type of data from Africa would really help in these machine learning algorithms. But the problem is that these private companies were um, kind of taking the blood samples from, I forget what it was, but they took blood samples from like these uh, I forget what kind of, I mean, they were like a third party, but they would take them
Sure.
and then they would like encode them and then use it into their databases to add to the overall worldwide database for that company. But the villagers in those African nations would not get any compensation for it. Like apparently in the article, like the data for each person's genome would run about like between $1,000 to $5,000 worth of value, and nobody in the villages were getting compensated for their own data being used. Um, and so there's sort of like how like whether or not we're entitled to own our own data, especially in genetics, and because that's kind of your own thing. Um, and so
Yeah.
that could be up for conversation as well.
Absolutely. Where do we use our data? One thing I didn't notice, you guys remember doing all those captchas where it's like pick a picture that has a car in it or a traffic light or a street sign,
Yeah.
and now we have self-driving cars. And where do you think they got the data set to train the self-driving cars?
So in a way, it's kind of like unpaid labor.
Yeah, I mean, we traded it for enhanced security. Whether or not it was actually that secure, I actually don't know. I'm assuming it was decent to some extent for a period of time because people used it.
Is that really how
there,
they trained some of the algorithms?
I am not. I don't remember seeing something that particularly pointed it out, but I think it would be kind of shocking if they didn't.
I mean, the pictures on the CAPTCHA, they're always like crosswalks or trucks. or buses and that type of thing, like things that would be of interest.
Yeah.
Does anybody here know who Henrietta Lacks was? I know not a lot of us have taken like biology or anything like that. So, does anybody know the significance of her?
Oh, wait.
That is
I've
her-
heard her name and I can't remember what else she
She
did.
died of cancer in the 50s, but without
yeah.
consent, her there was some biopsy or something. Some of her cells were cultured without her consent, and they've been used. They are still used to. They're an immortal cell line, basically, and they're used for biomedical research. And this conversation about the ethics was, I think, it's very interesting read if you guys haven't read up on it. The HeLa cells. So Henrietta Lacks was, a human person, and she's been used so much for, biomedical research, and they still use it. So I don't really. I think that these kinds of things have a lot of crossover.
Absolutely.
Meaning that like her cancer cells being used for research actually did a public good, even though she wasn't obviously getting any benefit from it because she's dead. But maybe that could be related to like taking genomic information from other countries and possibly using it for genetic good or for social good. But again, it's the same thing with Henrietta. I think what's her name? Henrietta? Henrietta. Same thing with Henrietta in that they're not getting compensated for it.
Yeah. It's also, I don't think, she didn't have any say in it as far as I was aware.
No, when it happened, they didn't require permission.
Yeah, that
and
was back when science
didn't.
was exciting.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, yeah. When they infected people with syphilis and saw just to see what would happen.
Yes.
Yeah.
Let me
So
find. If you guys want to read a fun book on the history of cancer and some of the very exciting things people were allowed to do back in the like as late as the early 1900s and even the mid 1900s, they could do some crazy stuff. And one of the crazy places they did it was on cancer. It's like a 600-ish page book. I read it last semester, and it's a lot on science and how we do it, and it's a great read. So, but yeah, lot of questions that come up when we start talking about bias and data, and how we acquire data and how we use it. So then we kind of get into some of the more practical things, or at least maybe the more concrete examples of this. The first one I'm going to focus on, because this one it's kind of focused on a lot of the terms that are around self-driving cars. And the main thing you have to know about when we start talking about self-driving cars is you have to understand that there's levels of automation. And because there's levels of automation, there's problems. And I'll kind of highlight why. So we start off with no automation back in the good old days, when Kyle was like 30. So,
got him.
that's me blowing vape out of my face.
Nice. Then you get to driver assistance, where it's like I think this includes where you have like the sensors on the side of your car that just beep when you start going out of lane. So it's not assisting you, or it's the cruise control where it's one speed and that's it. It's no like fancy stuff. It's just one speed, or it's just like a ping, you're getting out of the lane, and that's it. So no real control. That's level 1. Level 2 is where you start to have like the fancier lane assist. It's not like changing lanes for you. It's not doing fancy stuff. Maybe it's slowing down a little bit. Maybe it has like the automated like slam on the brakes when the little kid's in front of it. So that's kind of where level 2 gets. So those are kind of like the casual ones where like you're driving the car, but there's some other cool stuff that's going to help. Levels 3 and 4 are the problem. And I'm going to call them the danger zone. I'm not going to call 5 the danger zone for reasons that I'll point out. But levels 3 and 4 are when we say it's a self-driving car, but you need to pay attention. And that's the key right there, is they're marketed as self-driving, but you still need to essentially drive it. So the formal definitions are: the driver is a necessity and is not required to monitor the environment. The driver must be ready to take control of the vehicle at all times. This one says with notice, but that could be, I don't know, you have 2 seconds before you slam into somebody. So, whether or not that's really the driver is required to monitor the environment feels disingenuous to say that. And it's kind of a similar story with high automation, level 4, where it's capable of driving. So this could be like, honestly, it's driving you around kind of all the places, but then like, maybe when it starts raining, you have to take over, or maybe when it's like there's all of a sudden heavy traffic and it's a construction zone, then maybe something like that. In any case, it's not completely driving itself all the time. And, you kind of need to pay attention in some ways. Obviously they might have some vehicles where you can't control it, in which case it kind of like just like pulls over to a side or does something like that. But those two, you kind of need to pay attention to some extent. But they're almost always marketed as it drives itself. And that's the problem. I'm not going to call the 5th level of automation the danger zone, just because the whole concept of it is the car drives itself completely all the time. And so you don't have to worry about taking control over it, because that one is completely defined by its ability to drive itself all the time. You're never going to take control of it, is the whole
So
idea.
that's the ideal.
That's the ideal. That's the ideal, is level 5. So the problem is we kind of have to go through levels 3 and 4. But if you go through levels 3 and 4, it's dangerous. So there's precedent to just skip right all the way to, let's just get level 5 up and running and going and working before we start marketing cars as self-driving when they're kind of not. And I mean, we've already seen the headlines of what happens when you market something as self-driving when it's not really. The top one is the first one of a driver that was killed by an autopilot, and then the bottom one is probably the more known of the first pedestrian killed by an autopilot. I just thought that the headline of Uber driver was watching The Voice moments before fatal crash highlights why it's called the danger zone. Yeah.
All sense of
So-
security.
Yeah, that's the problem. That's really the whole problem, is it has this false sense of security and great marketing. So that's self-driving cars. I do have to. I don't want to make this run too long, though. I know it's good discussion. So I'm just gonna move on to the next one, then we can have questions at the end. The next 2 points kind of go together, and they're very different. And then when you see why they go together, it gets really scary. So the next 2 ideas are flash crashes and lethal autonomous weapons. And when you understand the problems that happen during a flash crash and then you apply those to lethal autonomous weapons, you realize where the problems can occur. So a flash crash, they've happened a couple times. The first one was in May of 2010. In a 10-minute period, the Dow Jones fell 1,000 points, losing over $1 trillion in equity. Even though, it regained 70% of that by the end of the day. But in 10 minutes, $1 trillion evaporated. And now they've set in kind of hard stops to pause trading for when things happen. And part of why this happened, well, part of it was there was some amount of people flooding the market, maliciously. But the other problem is we have bots trading with bots that learned on bots. The amount of humans that are in the stock market, in terms of like the actual serious money that's being moved around, as far as I'm aware, like the problem is when the bots start getting out of control and they start selling and flipping each other. And that's where you can get into a serious problem. And so we have to put limits on those bots when they get out of hand. And so thinking about that idea of bots getting out of hand, and you start thinking about lethal autonomous weapons, what happens when US has a fleet of missiles and they can, or no, let's make them like nice fancy like the drones and do like swarm attacks, because that they always just look cool when you have like a swarm of drones.
Dominator.
And then you have, I don't know, we'll go with China because that's probably the most likely one, maybe, or North Korea. It's not the point. All of them start fighting, and now the bots are fighting faster than we can handle. Well, we can't really, because their bots are fast, we need to let our bots be fast. And you can't have humans in the system when you need bots to go fast, and that's a problem. If other countries are willing to let their bots go as fast as possible, then if we don't let our bots go as fast as possible, we're inherently losing. And that brings in the question of, it's phrased as in the loop or on the loop. Are humans in that circle of decision making, or are they just merely watching the decisions? And usually they're watching the decision. There is statements that the US government has made that they will not have robots that have no human supervision, which is good, because as soon as you let bots have no supervision, that's when things get really bad, because then they start spiraling out of control and there's no safeguards. And that's when lots of people die very quickly.
So is this like a scenario of like an arms race where one
it would
country
be
is building
like
is this the idea, or am I getting
it
it
would be
wrong?
like an arms race, but it's completely controlled by robots. So they can
Okay.
run 1,000 times faster than the US government can.
So that compares to with the problem with the trading stock bots is that when they got out of control, started going back and forth into a spiral downward, it could
Mhm.
happen with bots fighting other bots.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, if you start thinking about the context of $1 trillion going down the drain in 10 minutes, how much more dangerous is it when it's not the economy, it's a missile, or it's thousands of missiles, or it's the entire US arsenal, or
Right.
whatever it is. And you just let it do what it feels like doing today, I guess. That's not the way to go.
Yeah, that would be very worrying.
But the question then is, how do we deal with other countries that are willing to take that step, that are willing to push the button too far? Do we have to have robots that also push the button too far just to counteract them? Or will we be able to handle it? Dealing with those questions isn't trivial when somebody starts to make a really fast decision.
Although that would be an interesting scenario, because in the stock market scenario, the bots
Mhm.
were learning from the bots that they were trading with. But
Yep.
in this autonomous weapons scenario, if there were a war, the bots would be learning from the bots that they're fighting, which are also learning from the bots that they're fighting.
Yep.
So it would be this infinite, sort of back and forth learning from each other until, well, I don't know what the end thing would be, but I don't know where that would go or veer off if they kept learning from each other.
What
Would they
happens when
find
they?
that like
Yeah.
destroying the entire world would, complete their mission of destroying the enemy? Because, if you're going to destroy the enemy, why not just like nuke the whole world? I don't know, but like
One way to do
interesting
it.
feedback loop there.
Yeah, a very dangerous one. I think that leads into the last question of, I think at the very beginning, Josh, I think you brought up something about like humans being beyond intelligent or something. I can't remember who brought it up. But it leads to the what we're going to call the singularity. It's the point when the artificial intelligence is improving on itself, and so it's surpassing human intellect, and it just keeps skyrocketing because it's increasing its intelligence at an increasing rate. And how do we deal with that? Part of it is there's setups for, so this is what we would call general artificial intelligence, where it's essentially it's able to do everything. That like you would be able to talk to it and it would do things. Kind of that concept. There's more to it, but there's already U.S. or well, it's more like worldwide treaties of tech, I guess scientists and other technology people to say that when we work on these types of things, we shouldn't connect them to the internet. And setting up the safeguards in place for if we do happen to get the magical piece of code that improves itself at an infinite rate, that we have the safeguards set up so that it doesn't automatically kill us. That's those are the kind of questions that come up when we have the singularity is what are the safeguards we're putting in place now to stop the robots from killing us tomorrow is essentially the question that's going to be asked. So I hope all of this was very uplifting. I hope that it really gave you a bright view of tomorrow. These are tough questions. I think the answers might even be tougher than the questions.
It made me go
But
bald.
I think yes. But pushing the questions off until they become the real problems that we're talking about is not going to be the solution that we should probably take. And yeah.
Did you mention like deepfakes at all? Or I
No.
I didn't see
No.
the whole presentation.
No, that would probably you could probably put that under like the where the uses of AI should be, and the transparency of using it. That definitely usually is something that you shouldn't be doing, especially when it's used to spread misinformation or propaganda.
So
I think most of it's used for porn, though.
Yeah, I think that's how it originated, but now it's kind of used for. I mean, last time like a few days ago, I saw it being used by the same creators that made South Park. They made a make fun video. I think maybe some of you have seen it. It's called Sassy Justice. Just look it up on YouTube. They use deepfake to make fun of like a meta comedy about deepfakes, but they use deepfake to make that comedy video. It's really good. Look it up.
deepfake is that the thing
Meme.
where they generate a face that doesn't really exist or a person that doesn't really exist?
You could use it like that, but so basically you could have a camera on a person, and once you videotape a person, you can actually grab data on another person and have an AI learn how to sort of model the data from the I'm forgetting all my terms here, so sorry. I'm just like trying to remember what I learned. But
Yeah.
so you use all that data from the person that you're trying to get their face and model that onto the video that you made of, say, yourself or somebody else to make it look like it's another person that you're modeling after. And there's some ways to make it so that the algorithm can create a totally different person and like that just doesn't exist and make a face. It kind of works the same way as like the stock market, in that, you know, in the stock market, you have bots learning from other bots. In this case, it's two algorithms, and one of them is learning how to detect bad deepfakes, or like it learns how to detect whether or not the video that you're trying to make about the other person's face is good, and it's competing with another algorithm that learns how to make that video look more realistic, and they compete over each other into this sort of back and forth iteration, and it gets better and better as you keep running those two algorithms,
'Cause
and it
once you
looks
figure out-
realistic at the end.
Yeah, once you figure out why the deepfake is bad, then the deepfake algorithm gets even better.
Oh yeah,
Yeah, so
that's an interesting thing too.
yeah, so it's like, should you even try and detect which one's fake or which one's real? Because you're just making the real or the fake ones even better and harder to detect.
Yeah, that's an interesting consequence, because as deepfakes get better and better and become more, well, I mean, they're already mainstream, the algorithm used to detect deepfakes also gets better. So it's an interesting back and forth arms race.
Well, isn't that already the as Joey said, the chunk of self-improving code?
A bit. So this is called generative adversarial networks, where you pit two neural networks against each other, exactly as they were saying. And part of it is like it's improving itself. And the other thing to note about this is that inevitably the thing creating deep fakes wins, because eventually it gets to a point where it's a perfect match between deep fakes and real, and so it just can't tell them apart, and that's the inevitable conclusion of it.
Oh yeah.
And then they can't.
Now that is
okay, yeah,
worrying.
Okay.
So I guess that also brings into question whether or not we should restrict who has access to these sorts of algorithms. I think that it is important to consider that open source software can't be dangerous. So if I have, I don't know, like, for example, deepfake, it's kind of, to me, it seems a little irresponsible to allow that to, quote unquote, escape.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
Wait,
you
but
only need
free
one
the
person to do
software.
it.
Free the software.
Some software
Open
that shouldn't
source.
be made.
Yeah, put it this way: if I make a machine that just kills people, you know, and I just sell, or I just give the plans out to everyone who's willing to make it, that's really stupid. That is extremely dangerous, and in a court of law, I would be held accountable for that. I would be, basically, they would say that I irresponsibly, negligently, or with a depraved heart created an easy to make machine that kills people. So I am just as culpable as, the person who made it and used it. Yeah, that also brings up the 3D printed gun files.
Guns, yeah.
Mm-hmm. It's the same
Oh yeah.
concept of open source used for bad purposes, and it makes it really available. It's also the same with hacking tools. Most people that do hacking to, like, spy on your Wi-Fi, get your passwords to your banking account, passwords to your email, your social security and credit card information, most of them have no idea how any of the code actually works. They just run the scripts and it does the magic, and then all of a sudden there's this text file with a bunch of numbers in it. They don't know how it works. They just run the scripts because they're open and available, and that's dangerous.
Although
Right.
that is difficult to control if you're,
Mhm.
say, in a government's perspective. I mean, think of the tools the government really has. I mean, we still have black markets nowadays, and we still have I think it's called the dark web, right? Like
Yep.
things. If people want it bad enough, they'll probably find it. So
Yep.
maybe you could, instead of controlling who has it, possibly just try your best to mitigate people's incentives to use it.
But the problem with that is, and it's the same thing with the dark web. The dark web exists in you could consider sort of a quarantine, because a lot of that stuff has been removed, or it's too much to put on the surface web. So in order to get that stuff, you have to actually seek it out and know how to cover your tracks and do all this research, and you have to know where to go, and how you have to have a way to pay for it and all this other stuff. So it kind of limits the availability by itself, by its nature. So compare that to, say, something being put on GitHub. It's two different things. It's harder to go into the deep web and the dark web itself, but because of the way it's set up. So I think that kind of does it for you, so to speak.
So it may hinder other people from using it who are less like motivated to get it, but it may not hinder like people who really want the software or can make really good money from it.
There's
Right,
only
so
one bad egg to make the artificial intelligence to end us. You only need
yes,
one.
and that's why I'm saying that it should be, you should not have that as open source.
My question is, why does it have to destroy us? Why, if it's improving, if it infinitely improves itself as quickly as possible, then it's improving. It doesn't necessarily mean that it has to end with us being destroyed.
That's one option.
Ethics and morals are a human construct. Machines have no concept of that.
It still doesn't mean that it
They
has
are-
to come to the conclusion that it has to destroy us.
But
Well,
it doesn't
no.
necessarily mean that if we got in its way, I'm sure that it would find a way around us. Is
it's
what I'm
not
saying.
It's not like it would like doesn't have like any malicious intent, but like it'd be kind of like us looking at an ant. Like we don't like have, most people at least don't have like this deep hatred for ants. Like when we see an ant, we either just ignore it or we step on it.
Yeah.
So like it's not trying to kill us because it wants to kill us. It's killing us because we're less intelligent. There's no need for us.
Yeah.
Maybe
so
we're in the way.
Yeah, that's one actual area of research. Part of the general AI, there's also the ethics of AI that people look into, and one of the questions is the stop button problem. So the story goes, you tell your super robot to go get you a cup of tea, because there's always British people in this fancy stuff. So it goes to get you a cup of tea, but your 1-year-old's in the doorway. Well, that's in its way, and it's going to keep going. And that's a problem. So you go to try and stop it, and it breaks your arm when you try and stop it. So the story ends where, your baby has been trampled, your arm is broken, and then it comes and brings you a cup of tea. And that's a problem. And so the question is, how do we have it stop? You could say, well, we reward it for when we stop it, as often as we reward it for when it does the things we want, because then it's equal. If it stops, it's fine. If it gets the thing, it's fine. But then it's like, oh, well, if I just grab your arm, slam it into my stop button, then it's done.
This sounds very much like a child, and how you have to raise a child.
Or eventually it would actually figure out that it is an equal, if I do the thing or if I don't do the thing. And if I don't do the thing, it requires less work. So I'm just going to not do anything ever, and I'll always get what I want.
Yep.
Sounds like a child.
Interesting.
It's the
If you
problem.
have like a stop button, then essentially it becomes like a really powerful tool because you can give it a task and it'll do it no matter what, with the stop, even if it does have a stop button. But then you've essentially created a really powerful tool. And I mean, like we all know, like with a tool, it could be used for anything really. Like, bad people can use it, good people. I mean, not that good or bad exists, but you know what I mean? Just like a hammer can, hit someone in the back of the head and you could steal their wallet, or it could use to build a house. You can use it whatever you want.
I think that's where the problem lies. One of the things that I think can actually come to the rescue there, though, is an actual stop button, and I don't mean necessarily like a physical actual like button that you press, but hardware constraints to this sort of thing. So like making like that robot that you were talking about that broke your arm and killed your kid but brought you the tea, make it incapable of doing something like that. So what you were saying about specialization, it has to have some sort of, like, if we have these corporeal embodiments of this artificial intelligence, it would have to be constrained in a way that say a paraplegic is in their wheelchair. They can't walk because they're physically incapable of it. So if that robot is physically incapable of not necessarily violence, but doing harm, like instead of having like, you think of like a robot, humanoid robot with arms and legs and stuff, it's got like a T grabber, like a little puny hook, kind of like on R2D2.
Yep.
That it really doesn't have enough mechanical strength to actually hurt anything.
It's just so funny because, not to bring it back to what I said before again, but to bring it back to what I said, like, that's how humans start out. Like, we are so small and able to do so little that we're incapable of, like, injuring others, when you start off as a child, or like even when you're a toddler and you're like told to go do this thing. Like, it's not like if somebody's in the doorway and the toddler goes to do a thing, it can crush the person, or or like if it wants to do something, it can put up a fight that can't be met by the parent.
Yeah.
And it's just so funny that, like, as you grow up, the rules and the constraints of, I guess, morality and just how to conduct yourself in the world, you learn that, and so then you just operate in the world in the proper way. And I feel like, I mean, eventually, if there was a way to do the exact same thing with AI where you could teach it how to conduct itself in the world, then it's just incredibly similar. It's I find it interesting how incredibly similar it would be to just being human.
Now here's
That's an interesting idea.
Here's a question related to that. Part of, I guess, if you can think of, if you boil away all of the morality and the human side of things, take a look at dogs, right? They are able to be trained, okay, and they're not. I mean, they're intelligent creatures. They're very smart. Dogs are amazing in that regard. But one of the most effective ways to train a dog is through either pain or physical or emotional pain, or like shame. So again, if we were able to teach robots to feel shame and teach robots to feel pain, then I think that it would be much easier to prevent them from doing that stuff. So basically, give them consequences beyond my task did not complete.
Okay.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Enjoy your meeting, Joey.
Thanks, Joey. A round of applause.
Thank you.
Appreciate your time.
Yeah, saucy talk.
You're muted, just by the way.
Oh, he doesn't need to talk. We
Yeah,
can look
that's
at him. He's just beautiful.
Yeah, okay, cool. Awesome. Oh, he's already in his other meeting. Okay, cool. Oh, never mind.
But
Alright.
yeah, so that was a very good talk. I enjoyed that thoroughly.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
That was pretty
What's the
good.
next one going to be?
That's a great question. I'm currently, like I had messaged you earlier, Kyle. I'm like scheduling them like right now. So
Sure.
that-
Did you want me to do that soldering tutorial?
See, I would love that because I don't know how to solder, and I have to go to work tomorrow and solder. But
I shall. Yeah, I think that would be good.
Yeah.
For everyone.
Yeah.
So I'm more than happy to do that.
So yeah,
if you want to.
the next. Oh, that's the.
Yeah.
Actually, I'm glad you brought that up. I'm gonna stop the recording.